Have you ever noticed how often we assume where someone ends up is linked to where they began? Family, city, class. The doors are already open or firmly closed. Power has a way of shaping possibility long before talent ever enters a room. For a long time, and in many ways still today, the world quietly teaches us who we are allowed to become, who belongs, who gets access, who is expected to adapt rather than define. This story begins in an era very different from ours, but in many ways, the challenges and the tension feel similar. Because while systems have changed, some barriers have been removed, and opportunities have expanded, the challenge of identity has remained. If anything, it has become more complex. In a world shaped by rapid change, and increasingly by AI, the question of who you are cannot be outsourced. Self-definition matters more than ever. This chapter is not about fashion. It's about identity, about agency, about choosing who you become before the world decides for you. And it begins with a woman the world would later know as Coco Chanel, long before the name carried power, status, or certainty. Welcome back to The Strategic Thinker, or TST for short. If you're a regular listener, thank you. Your presence and curiosity continue to shape this community. If this is your first time here, I'm glad you found us. TST is a sanctuary for your mind, a calm space away from the noise where you can slow down, think deeply, and reset your direction. Every conversation here is designed to help you approach life, work, and decisions with more intention and clarity. I'm Alan, your host. This is the Path to Greatness series, a deeper exploration into the lives of iconic people and brands to gain a deeper understanding of the thinking, the struggles, and the decisions that shaped who they became. Let's dive in. Before we talk about Coco Chanel, we need to take a short walk into the history, because greatness never emerges in a vacuum. It's shaped by the time you are born into, the social structures around you, and the invisible rules that define who gets access, voice, and legitimacy. For much of history, where you end up in life was closely tied to where you started. This is still true in some parts of the world. Your family name, your royal connections, your class, your gender, the neighborhood you were born into. Identity was often assigned before it was chosen, even more so in the past. Even though the world has changed dramatically since the early 20th century, this tension has not disappeared. Access still matters, power still concentrates, and the question of who gets to define themselves remains deeply relevant, perhaps even more so in a modern algorithm-driven world. This is the environment into which Coco Chanel was born, not into privilege, not into influence, not into a world designed to make her rise easy. She entered a society with rigid expectations about class and a woman's place in the world. A society where identity was largely inherited rather than authored. And yet, Chanel did something extraordinary. She did not simply seek success within the rules of her time. She questioned the rules themselves. You might think that this is a story about fashion. It's a story about self-definition, about deciding who you are allowed to be when the world has already decided for you, about creating an identity when the existing options feel too small, about choosing direction before permission. As we move through this chapter, we are not asking how Coco Chanel became famous. We are asking something more fundamental. How does someone redefine themselves when access is limited, power is uneven, and the future is unclear? What does it take to move from survival to authorship? And what can that teach us about identity, agency, and strategic self-belief today? This is where the journey begins. In Chapter 1, we explore origins and how the act of choosing who you become often starts long before the world is ready to agree. I hope we can learn from Coco along the way and have the courage to dream and chase the dreams. So, where should we begin this incredible adventure? Gabrielle Chanel was born in 1883 in Saumur, a small town in western France. France was living through the later years of the Third Republic, a period marked by sharp contrasts. Industrial growth and cultural sophistication flourished in cities like Paris, while poverty and social immobility remained deeply entrenched elsewhere. When her mother, Jean, died in 1895, Gabrielle was just 12 and was sent to an orphanage run by nuns in Aubazine. It was not unusual for the era. Many children, especially girls from poor families, grew up in orphanages. Most would live lives that closely mirrored their beginnings. The orphanage was austere, quiet, structured. Days were shaped by routine, discipline, and repetition. Clothing was planned. Function mattered more than expression. In fact, expression was highly discouraged. Personal choice was limited. Gabrielle learned to sew there. It was not represented as a path to independence or creativity. It was simply a skill, a way to be useful. Little did young Gabrielle know, it was a skill that would later change her life and leave a lasting impact on the world. When she turned 18 in 1901, she hit the age limit for staying at the orphanage, so she moved to a boarding house in Moulins. Shortly after, she began working as a seamstress. She sang briefly in cafes in the evenings where she earned the nickname Coco. At this stage, her life was modest, unremarkable by historical standards. There was no obvious signal of what would come next. Through a series of relationships, she entered social worlds far removed from her own upbringing. She met Etienne Bossan, an officer and textile heir. Through him, she was introduced to high society, parties, and luxury, grand country estates, horse racing. It was here that she began designing hats as a hobby, which eventually launched her career. Later, she met Arthur Boy Capel, an English businessman with a sharper understanding of ambition and commerce. He moved comfortably between social classes and saw potential where others saw novelty. These environments were defined by ease and entitlement. They were populated by people for whom stability was inherited, not earned. Gabrielle was present in these spaces, but she was not native to them. She did not fully belong. That distance sharpened her awareness. She watched closely. She noticed how women moved, how restricted their bodies were by corsets and layers, how elegance often came at the expense of comfort and practicality. She observed clothing that signaled status but limited movement, attire designed to be seen rather than lived in. She did not set out to change these norms. She altered clothing for herself first. Simpler lines, fewer restrictions, pieces that allowed movement. At that time, this was not revolutionary. It was simply practical, almost unremarkable. In 1910, she moved to Paris. Paris in 1910 was a city of many faces. On the surface, it was confident, luminous, and expanding. La Belle Époque was still in motion. La Belle Époque means the beautiful era in French. This era lasted from the late 19th century to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. The rare extended period of peace allowed upper and middle classes to thrive, making this a golden age of prosperity and optimism. For Coco Chanel, this was the era she was born into and grew up in. During La Belle Époque, Cafes spilled onto sidewalks, theaters, salons, and racecourses attracted wealth and attention. Electricity, automobiles, and new forms of leisure signaled modernity. Paris saw itself as a cultural capital of Europe. Yet beneath that polish, the city was deeply stratified. Social class was visible everywhere, in posture, in speech, in clothing, in who moved freely through certain spaces and who did not. Wealth and lineage carried weight. Access mattered. Power was inherited, more than earned. For women especially, the rules were narrow. Upper-class women were dressed to signal status, not autonomy. Corsets shaped bodies into rigid forms. Clothing restricted movement, breadth, and independence. Elegance often came at the cost of comfort. Fashion was less about expression, but more about conformity to class expectations. Working-class women lived in a different Paris altogether. Many labored long hours in workshops, laundries, and cafes. Wages were low, security was lacking, survival required endurance rather than imagination. Movement between these worlds or classes was rare. Paris offered opportunity, but not equality. The city rewarded those who already belonged. For outsiders, especially women without wealth or family name, progress required proximity to power, passions, and alertness. This was the Paris Coco entered. She arrived without status, without protection, without a clear path, yet she arrived at the moment of transition. Traditional structures still dominated, but cracks were beginning to form. Modern life was accelerating. Old rules were still holding, but under strain. The city was crowded with ambition. Artists, writers, performers, entrepreneurs. Many arrived with little and hoped to remake themselves. Paris allowed reinvention, but only for those willing to read the room carefully, those who observed before acting, and those who understood what was valued and what was missing. Coco moved through these spaces quietly. She saw how wealth created distance, how leisure assumed security, how time itself was a privilege. She noticed how women dressed not for themselves, but for approval, how elegance often looked beautiful, yet impractical, how comfort was treated as indulgence rather than necessity. She also noticed something else. The city admired novelty. As long as it arrived wrapped in familiarity, Paris welcomed change, but only when it felt inevitable in hindsight. This tension mattered. Had she arrived decades earlier, tradition might have suffocated her. Had she arrived much later, the space she sensed might already have been claimed. In 1910, Paris stood at a threshold. Old hierarchies remained, but the future had yet decided its shape. For someone attentive, adaptable, and quietly ambitious, that uncertainty carried possibility. Coco did not yet know what form her path would take, but Paris, in that moment, offered something rare, a place where constraints were visible, cracks were forming, and those willing to work within the tension could begin to find footing. With financial support from Capel, she opened a small hat boutique at 21 Rue Cambon. This was not luck in isolation. It was timing, readiness, and proximity converging. Because the building already housed an established dressmaker, her lease initially restricted her to sell only hats. It was a key area for fashion. Little did she know that this area would remain an important place for her decades into the future. In Paris, fashion reflected hierarchy as much as taste, as social structures remained rigid. Her hats stood out not because they were extravagant, but because they were restrained. They stripped away excess. They felt modern without announcing themselves as such. Women began to notice. Her elegant hats gained fame when popular actresses like Gabrielle Dozier began wearing them in plays and modeling them in magazines. What started as a modest shop quietly grew. When Coco arrived in Paris, she wasn't intending to spark change. She arrived with observations, with skills shaped by necessity, with a perspective formed by standing just outside the worlds she had entered. Many girls shared her beginnings. Very few crossed into different futures. History remembers the ones who made it. It forgets the many who didn't. At this moment in her story, the outcome was still unknown. What existed was a transition, a shift from survival to possibility, and the condition that made the next chapter possible were already in motion. Her eye for simplicity, her network, her positioning. Before I share what stood out to me, I hope you've already been thinking. Maybe something in her childhood stayed with you. Maybe it was the social leap. Maybe it was the way she observed before she acted. That's the beauty of studying a life. We don't all extract the same lesson. And I'd be just excited if your insight is different from mine. That said, here are 4 things that stood out to me from this first chapter of Coco's journey. 1. Identity is claimed. She was born Gabrielle Bonheur Chanel in 1883, daughter of a traveling street vendor, raised in an orphanage after her mother died, with almost no structural advantage. Yet at the same point, she stopped being Gabrielle. She became Coco. Now on the surface, that sounds trivial, a nickname from her singing days, a stage identity. But I don't think it was that trivial. Names matter. Identity matters. Especially in a society like late 19th and early 20th century France, where class boundaries were rigid, mobility was limited, and social position was inherited more often than earned. To rename yourself is to redraw your boundaries. She did not wait for Paris to validate her before she redefined herself. She stepped into a new identity first. Recognition came later. That sequence, I feel, is important. Many of us wait for credentials, promotions, applause, and permission before we step into who we believe we could become. She reversed it. She embodied it before the world agreed. And in today's world, especially in an AI-driven future where roles are shifting rapidly, identity may become even more self-defined than inherited. The question then becomes, what version of yourself are you still waiting to claim? 2. Reinvention often begins with quiet dissatisfaction. There were many girls in orphanages in France at that time. Many learned to sew, many faced hardship, many had limited options. Most did not end up in Paris opening boutiques. So, what was different? We don't have a dramatic speech for her declaring ambition. But her pattern of movement tells us something. She left the orphanage, she sought independence, she entered environments outside her social class. She chose proximity to possibility. That suggests something deeper, a quiet dissatisfaction. Not rage, not rebellion for the sake of rebellion, just a refusal to accept that her starting point was her ending point. Reinvention rarely begins with clarity. It often begins with discomfort, a feeling that something about your current life fits, but not fully, a sense that you are capable of more, even if you cannot articulate what more looks like. That tension is easy to suppress, especially when survival is stable, especially when comfort increases. But that tension is often the birthplace of transformation. I suspect there was something in her that simply could not settle, and that internal friction may have been her greatest asset. 3. She leveraged what she had, not what she lacked. This one is important. It's easy to romanticize her story, to say she rose purely through brilliance. But if we look carefully, she was strategic. She understood her strengths. She was attractive. She had presence. She could sing. She could sew. None of those guaranteed empire, but they created leverage. She used performance to gain visibility. She used charm to gain access to circles above her birth status. She used sewing to build economic independence. When she met Etienne Bausan, she gained exposure to the French elite. Through him, she entered country estates, horse racing circles, aristocratic salons. Later, Arthur Boyd Capel provided financial backing to open her boutique in 21 Rue Cambon in 1910. Was that luck? Of course, but luck met readiness. She had already developed skill. She had already cultivated taste. She had already observed how elite women lived and dressed. Many people meet opportunity unprepared. She didn't. And here's the deeper lesson. She did not obsess over what she lacked. She did not have inherited wealth. She did not have institutional endorsement. But she worked with what she had. That mindset is timeless, especially today when comparison is constant and perceived disadvantage can feel paralyzing. The better question is, what assets are already in your hands that you have not fully leveraged? 4. Position yourself where serendipity can find you. This is subtle. We like to say success is pure merit or pure luck. Reality is more nuanced. She did not wake up in Paris with a boutique by accident. She placed herself in proximity to influence. She entered rooms she did not fully belong to yet. She observed, she adapted. She moved from provincial life to the center of cultural energy. That position matters. Serendipity rarely knocks on closed doors. It tends to find those already in motion. There were countless talented women in France at that time. Few had positioned themselves at the intersection of skill, access, social observation, and internal ambition. When that moment came to open the first boutique in 1910, she was ready to step forward. That readiness is strategic. It reminds me of something we often overlook. We cannot control timing, but we can control preparation. We cannot guarantee opportunity, but we can increase the probability of recognizing it. Let me bring this back to you, because this series is not about fashion history. It's about owning your story. So here are a few reflections to sit with. What identity are you still carrying that belongs to an earlier version of you? Where do you feel that quiet dissatisfaction that you keep rationalizing away? What strengths are you underestimating because they feel ordinary? And are you positioning yourself where possibility can find you? Chapter 1 of Coco Chanel's life is not yet about empire. It's about self-definition. Before global brand, before legacy, before power, there was a young woman who decided that origin would not dictate outcome. That decision is timeless. And perhaps the real lesson of this chapter is simple. Transformation begins with owning your story. As we close this first chapter, I want to return to where we began. A girl born in 1883 in rural France, losing her mother young, sent to an orphanage, growing up in a world where social class often defined your ceiling before you even understood the rules of the game. There were many girls like her. Most of them remained where they started. We remember Coco Chanel because she did not. And it's tempting to reduce the difference to luck, beauty, timing, or powerful connections. All of those played a role, but underneath those visible factors, there was something less obvious. There was a decision. A quiet but persistent refusal to let her origin define her destiny. She did not wake up one day as a fashion icon. She did not leap from orphanage to empire. She moved through stages. Singer, companion, observer, miniler. At each stage, she used what she had. Her sewing skills, her presence, her ability to observe, her willingness to step into unfamiliar rooms. She did not control the era she was born into. She did not control the class she started in. She did not control the structures around her. But she did begin to control how she positioned herself within them. That is the deeper lesson of this chapter. Now, owning your story does not mean denying your starting point. It means refusing to let it be your final definition. It means recognizing the constraints of your environment while still asking, what is within my control? What strengths do I have? What doors might I push on even if they were not designed for me? In 1910 Paris, she found a foothold, not because everything was fair, not because the system was open, but because she was ready when the opportunity appeared. Serendipity favors the prepared, and preparation often looks unremarkable while it's happening. As we pause here, I want you to reflect on your own story. What parts of your identity have you accepted as fixed? What assumptions about your background, industry, or circumstances might be quietly shaping your ceiling? And where might you begin to own your story more fully? In the next chapter, we will explore what happened after the hat boutique. Because opening a shop is one thing, redefining how an entire generation of women dress, move, and express themselves is something else entirely. And that's where the story becomes even more interesting. Until the next chapter, let's embrace this principle. We may not control where we start, but we always have more influence over what we become than we think. If you prefer to revisit the ideas in writing, The Compass is the published companion to each episode, a concise reference you can return to. You'll find it at maisontst.com. Thank you for sharing this time with me. You hold the power to shape your destiny. Strategic thinking is your compass. We will build an amazing future, one thoughtful decision at a time. Until next time, keep getting better every day.